So I'm very happy to welcome you to today's virtual seminar series of the Qatar Centre for Global Banking and Finance. Our speaker today is Martin Ellison of Oxford University, who will talk to us about the economic impact of recession announcements. Before I give the floor to Martin, I would like to remind you the format of the talk. So we'll have a Q&A session of around 10 minutes towards the end. But during the first part of the talk, you're more than welcome to ask questions. There's a Q&A box, but we also would like to encourage you to just raise your hand, and questions are more than welcome. And so with no further ado, let me pass the floor to Martin Ellison. Please, Martin.
Thank you, Francesca, and thank you, David, for this invitation. It's really great to be able to talk here. I'm just scrolling through the list of attendees, and there's lots of friendly names there, so I'm saying hello and waving to all the people I know out there. Thank you for coming. Today's talk is called The Economic Impact of Recession Announcements. It's joint with Andy Eggers, who's a political scientist from Chicago, and Sang-Seok Lee, who's an economist from Bilkent. Today, we're going to be concerned with whether announcements can in themselves affect economic outcomes. As economists, there's lots of ways we immediately think that could be happening. It could be coming through some sort of sunspot that's working through a multiple equilibria story. Go back to the original idea of Keynes and animal spirits. Maybe an announcement can act as a coordinating device. More basically, perhaps the announcement in itself contains information because agents in the economy only have imperfect information. So some of the ones that we like in macro might be Mankiw and Rice with the limited information, Sims, limited processing capacity, and so on. In those worlds, the announcement will be informative because of the imperfect information. Another possibility is to think of those news shock stories that Baudry and Potier have made popular, that there are news in various things that tell you about future technology growth. This paper is not going to be about mechanisms whereby announcements can affect economic outcomes. I'm just going to leave that in the background as ways that we might think they could possibly affect. Instead, I'm going to be more of a theoretical, empirical analysis of trying to measure the effect of the announcements on the economy. We're not the first people to do this. There are various other papers out there, although this literature is reasonably small. I'd like to highlight three particular parts of that literature. One would be Statistical Revisions. That's quite close to what we're doing. Three papers that are highlighted there. So the idea there would be there's early revelation of data, and the first statistical releases have errors in them. So it might be the first release of GDP growth for the previous quarter is particularly optimistic just because of an error, and that's subsequently reversed in subsequent quarters. They can use that variation to see, well, did that error in the statistical release, did it actually cause any effect on the economy? Another literature in similar vein is the stale news literature, which looks to see whether agents actually react to announcements that don't in themselves create news because it's stale. And then finally, there are some nice papers on how coarsened ratings interact with announcements. So the first one of these is Filio and Lucas, which says, like, people really want to go to houses that are in the catchment area of a school that's graded excellent, rather than a school that's rated good. Even if we know all the details of why it's rated excellent rather than good, and even if we know that this school only just crept over the boundary to be excellent, you're much more willing to buy a house or rent a house from that area rather than go to an area where the school, which was just missed out on being rated excellent. The Pope et al. Study does the same for hospitals, where you are really willing to pay a premium to go to a hospital that's rated excellent rather than good. That's got similarities to what I'm going to show you today. So let's get to today's plan. It's going to run off the idea that there's a recognized convention that you announce a recession after 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. We know that news media make a really big thing about whether the economy is in a recession or not. So that binary distinction has a large impact on what the news media are reporting. But that distinction could be highly arbitrary when the growth is very close to zero. A very slight negative growth for 2 quarters can result in the calling of a recession, whereas a very slight positive growth in one of those quarters would stop the recession being announced. Essentially, the growth here is zero, and those 2 situations would be very similar. It's arbitrary whether you just growth happen to flip above or below the zero line. Those of you who've done applied microeconometrics will recognize where this is going. There's going to be a discontinuity between recession announcements and the underlying fundamentals. Crossing the zero line can be triggering the announcement of a recession, whereas not crossing does not. And that's going to give us an opportunity to study the effects on news media of there being a recession using regression discontinuity designs. You might be wondering where this convention came from. Why did we suddenly start to talk about 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth is a recession? It traces back to Arthur Okun, who was on the Council of Economic Advisors back in the 1960s. So he's advising the president, and the president is worried that he doesn't want to say we're in a recession. Art had the neat idea that if we define a recession in a way that means people could say we're not actually in a recession, that essentially gets the president off the back of the hook. And that's exactly what he did. He invented this idea of, for you to be in a recession, it had to be 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. So the president could say, oh no, we're not in a recession. We've had this technical definition. So it was a little bit of a sort of a political trick to get the president out of trouble. But as we all know, it stuck very, very firmly as a way that's used in almost all countries as a way to define the economy being a recession. Let's look at a few examples. Here we're in Germany. And this is taken from Süddeutsche Zeitung newspaper. And it's in 2001. You'll have to forgive my German pronunciation, but Deutschland befindet sich in einer Recession. Germany finds itself in recession. This is on the economy pages. Down at the bottom, the growth in 2001 quarter 2 had been minus 0.03%. In quarter 3, it was minus 0.14%. So yes, negative, and 2 quarters of negative growth, but very, very tight to zero in terms of the amount of negative growth we get. Yet still, the newspaper is full of a story that says you're in a recession. Here we're in Italy, where my pronunciation is a little bit better. This is Corriere della Sera. L'Istat conferma e recessione. So l'Istat is like the ONS for Italy, and they have confirmed it's a recession. This is back in January 1993. The relevant numbers are minus 0.5% and minus 0.6%. So very mildly negative, yet on the front page of the Corriere della Sera, the newspaper is screaming at you that we're in a recession. Japan, pronunciation hopeless at this point, but I'm assured that the thing in the top left in the blue circle is the word recession, and it's coming in the Nikkei Shimbun newspaper, minus 0.2%, minus 0.3%, 2001 quarter one, 2001 quarter two, and they're talking about the Japanese economy being in recession. Let me do a final example from the UK. So this is back in 2012. This is David Cameron's government. You may remember him. He's been in the news today a lot. So David Cameron's government, and data comes out saying minus 0.3%, minus 0.2%. The Guardian leads with UK sinks into double dip recession. Guardian, no friend of the Cameron government. So they're making a big splash about the economy going into recession. There's a lot of debate about austerity at the time. So the I newspaper on the right, austerity blame for Britain's double dip recession. So a lot of noise, a lot of political discussion around the fact that the economy has gone into recession. We unfortunately can't click on the link here, but if you click on the link, you get to the discussion in Parliament of that day. And it's like from 100 years ago. There's lots of people crammed into the Houses of Parliament and they're shouting and arguing all about this double dip recession. It's double dip because 2008, 2009 was the Great Recession, and then we went back in again. But then get back to June of that same year, and actually the ONS revised their estimates and declared that number there, which I'm in the middle, I hope you can see with the arrow, became a zero. And so they removed the double dip recession, and it didn't become a recession. Which just goes to show how arbitrary that was. And that's what's going to give us power, that almost randomly you announce a recession when growth is around zero. And we can use that randomness to see whether that has an effect on the economy. I'll pause there just slightly in case anybody wants to go in before I start to get more formal. Okay, serious scholars here who want to get more formal, and enough of this loose talk and media studies type of thing. Okay, let's go and do the regression discontinuity design. So, recession is going to be announced after 2 quarters of negative growth. Let's do this little 4-quadrant diagram. On the horizontal axis, I've got GDP growth from the previous quarter. And on the vertical axis, I've got GDP growth from the 2 quarters ago. So obviously, to have an announcement, to be in a recession, you've got to have both of those negative. So it's going to be this red situation here where you're going to end up with an announcement being occurring. Anything else? Top left, you're not in a recession here because 2 quarters ago it was positive. bottom right, you're not in a recession because it was positive last quarter, and top right, you're not in a recession because it's been positive for both quarters. Only if they're both negative do you get a recession. Now, if you look at this, there's actually two discontinuities. You could think of working along this horizontal axis, which is that, like, last quarter it was negative, and 2 quarters ago it was positive or negative, would define whether you're in recession. Or you can work along the vertical one, which is saying, okay, we know 2 quarters ago it was negative. Let's look at last quarter and see whether that was positive or negative. There's two discontinuities. What we're going to do is take what we think is the most obvious one to look at, which is the one that's highlighted in red here. So we're looking at situations where growth 2 quarters ago was negative, and we're going to be looking at whether growth in the previous quarter was positive or negative. We could have done the other one, and we've done some robustness stuff to do the other one, but we think this is the most obvious one to look at, that was growth in the last quarter positive or negative, and that would trigger whether you announce a recession or not. You can see I've shaded the whole quadrant in red of different intensities. But what's going to give our work some bite is to concentrate on these dark red regions, which are where the randomness is most clear. So it's where growth 2 quarters ago was negative, and growth this quarter was just slightly positive or just slightly negative. And I'm going to use the terminology here that just to the left is mildly in recession, and just to the right is mildly out of recession. So it becomes a close call to the right. You nearly made it, but you are mildly out of recession. There's a lot of econometrics then behind this that I don't really want to talk about. I'm just going to use, but these are called sharp regression discontinuity methods. Kaloniko and various co-authors tell you how to do this properly. In particular, they tell you what the optimal bandwidth is. The optimal bandwidth here is the width of that red area around the discontinuity that you should use most when you're estimating. And then you have a robust bias corrected inference because you're trading off efficiency versus bias in the way you're estimating. So I'm going to look at situations where 2 quarters ago it was negative, but then last quarter was either just a bit negative or just a bit positive. And I'm going to be comparing whether being just a bit negative give different effects on the economy to being just a bit positive. Right, let's get on with it. Data. It's obviously important that we use real-time data. We want to know what in a particular quarter they thought was the growth in the previous quarter and the quarter 2 quarters ago. So it's the growth at T-1, growth at T-2 as understood in period T. Now that's quite well organized from 1999 onwards by the OECD. They've got this revisions analysis data set where they tell you each release of GDP and the date it was released, and they keep a whole track of all the different releases. So that's fairly easy to go from 1999 onwards. The data before that, there's the real-time historical data set for the OECD is quite well organized too. That's maintained by the Dallas Fed, which enables us to go back kind of 1980s, early 1990s. Failing that, we can go and look at what national statistical agencies have been publishing. So go and look at the ONS publications and so on. And then really failing all that, we get The Economist out. You know, when you open The Economist, you open the back page, they've got the latest GDP estimates and the latest CPI inflation estimates. So we can track from there what the latest available estimates were. The Economist every week. So you'd think that they pick up the announcement quite quickly. We don't do very much of that, but it's our sort of go-to if we really need to, our backstop data source. In doing that, we've got to use the most recent data available at time t. Right. Here's the amount of data we managed to scrape together using all these sources. So you've got lots of countries, because recessions don't happen very often. This particular recession might not happen very often. So to get extra power into our data set, we're going to look at lots of different countries, about 30 or 40. The mildly in recession quarter is here saying 2 quarters ago it was negative, and 1 quarter ago we're just to the left of the discontinuity. So we were between 0 and minus 0.5. And you can see that happens a couple of times in Australia, once in Austria, a couple of times in Belgium, etc. The next column then is the similar calculation for just to the right of the discontinuity, so mildly out of recession quarters. And so there you get a 4 in Australia, 1 in Austria, 5 in Belgium, and so on. So when we add all those together, we get about 101 data points just to the left of the discontinuity and 132 points just to the right of the discontinuity. So there's a fair number of data points hanging around in that red area. If we look at these mildly in recession quarters, it's about half of the time that you were in a recession. So they're fairly common, these things. It's not a very weird special event that 2 quarters ago it was negative and 1 quarter ago it was just mildly negative, and that created a recession. I say about a half.
There's a Gulcin Oskan that has a question, so I will now ask her to unmute herself. Yes, there we go. Gulcin.
Martin.
Hi, Gulcin.
So good to see you. How are you?
Well, I can't see you. Your camera's not on, but...
Yes, I don't know. I think it's not possible to turn that on. That's fine. I have a very quick question.
Yeah.
I just wondered whether there is a way to double check if these periods were indeed called a recession.
So that's a very good question. Thank you, Gulcin. At the moment, I just said, if I was a statistician and reading the national statistics, I would conclude that they were a recession. What's going to come next is going to answer your question, because I'm going to map this to the media response, to whether there was a big scandal, a big discussion about whether there's a recession. Does that work for you?
Yeah, that was exactly my question. Thank you.
So it's coming because there's it's an interesting question because nobody actually sort of formally declares that this is a recession. You don't find any table that these are when 2 quarters of negative growth. It's only that 2 quarters of negative growth is picked up by everybody and talked about recession. But I haven't shown that yet. I will show.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So we've got quite a lot of data. Here I plotted you on the left the dynamics of what GDP growth looks like for those observations where I'm picking your mildly in recession. So you kind of potter along here, and growth is sort of mildly positive until t minus 3. It then goes negative in t minus 2. That's got to be true because that's my sample selection rule. And then it becomes mildly negative in t minus 1. Again, that's got to be true because that's how I've selected them. Then recovers and becomes positive and sort of trends back up again. So it's a short recession. Compare that straight away with the blue one. These are the dynamics that what happens if you're mildly out of recession. So you're going to be pottering along. T minus 2 is negative, so it's a quarter of interest. But then T minus 1 was just mildly positive, and so you're above the line, and you then potter along with a positive growth. Now, if you look at these two, doesn't look that there's a particularly huge amount of difference between what's happening prior to hitting this mildly in recession when you're, at T minus 3, T minus 4, etc., comparing the red line with the blue line. So it looks like it's pretty much the same dynamics hits, and then randomly you happen to just be plus or minus on the growth, so just slightly above or below the discontinuity, which is starting to give me confidence that I'm kind of okay with what I'm doing. But let me do that in a more formal sense.
Before you go on, let me unmute Raghav Mathur to ask a question. He had a question. Raghav, please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you so much. I mean, I think you might just be answering my question now. But my question is, well, does the total number of kind of in recession quarters being less than kind of this out of recession quarters represent some sort of over optimism when these kind of agencies are reporting growth numbers?
So your King's College London students are too bright. I'm sorry if you're not a student, but yeah, that's exactly where we're going now as to whether it's valid. I'm claiming that it's random, that whether you happen to go in there or not. Your question is alluding to maybe it's not because there might be incentives for them to do that. So let me talk you through it and then come back to me again, please, if you're not satisfied with the answer.
Sure. Thank you very much.
I haven't primed everybody to ask these questions, that it is, they are coming up genuinely. So it's all about the validity. Is this really a random thing that's happening? And my identification strategy is resting on the announcement being essentially random when you're close to zero. Now, you're right that could well be undermined if something is going on to manipulate that data. And the question that just came up, I think the behind it was thought that, well, maybe if it's slightly negative, they might say it's positive to avoid having to call a recession, that kind of manipulation. Or maybe if you're the ONS today, you hate the government so much that you take the positive number and you make it negative to announce a recession so that the government is punished. I think that's rather unlikely. But that kind of manipulation of data that's trying to stop or make recession announcements more. Well, that's something we can test. I'm going to test it in 3 different ways. One, I'm going to do a local polynomial density estimate. So I'm going to take all the points where growth was negative 2 periods ago, and I'm going to plot the density of growth 1 period ago. And if that manipulation is happening, you might think that density will be discontinuous at 0. So you'll be like removing some of the mass of the negative if you're trying to avoid announcing a recession and flipping them over to the positive side to create a bit more mass on the positive side. So that's one way we can start to test whether it really is random or whether there looks to be some manipulation going on. A second theme on that same idea is a binomial test. Let's count how many data points we have each side of the discontinuity. Is it roughly the same? Again, if it's manipulated, you might think, oh, they've taken data points that really ought to be recession ones, and they've fiddled the figures so they're not recession. You'd end up with more data points slightly to the right than to the left. And then finally, if the data is really manipulated to avoid recessions, you might think, well, they could do that when you have the preliminary data, because that's the one that causes a recession to be announced or not. But maybe when the final data, it's harder to hide that manipulation. We know there's lots of errors in first estimates. It will be quite easy to slip an extra 0.2% of growth into a preliminary estimate, but not the final estimate. So you might think then that you would have like not many announcements of recessions in the preliminary data, but more would come in afterwards. Again, we can test those things. So let's walk through the tests. Here's the density of real-time GDP growth on the left. So remember, this is growth 2 periods ago was negative, and this is growth in the previous period. And you're looking at these, it looks pretty much like those things are lining up at zero. There's the central estimate in the line, and then there's confidence bands, which I think are 90% confidence bands here, but very big overlap. If you do a test of do they overlap, the p-value is 0.56. Looking at that picture, it doesn't look as though there's missing density to the left, or indeed to the right, if you believe my ONS trying to get back at the government story. They line up at zero. There doesn't seem to be a discontinuity. I've also put for completeness here final GDP growth, and there's a bit more of a gap between the central estimates, but they still are lining up with the confidence bands, and the p-value is 0.65. So you can't reject a hypothesis that there's no discontinuity. There doesn't look to be evidence of manipulation here. Second story was, let's do a binomial test. Let's look at the number of data points on each side of the discontinuity. And that's what's going on here. So take a window of 0.05, so growth of 0.05% on either side of the window. We get 10 data points to the left. We get 10 data points to the right. Do a binomial test of whether those two numbers are the same. You're going to get a p-value of 1 because they absolutely are the same number. It doesn't look as though something is odd there. As you make the window wider, the numbers start to change a little bit, but at no point would you ever conclude that there's a statistically different number on both sides of the discontinuity. So it doesn't look like it's a problem that something is manipulating across. Finally, remember I said that maybe real-time data would be easier to manipulate than final data. So you might think there'd be less recessions announced based on real-time data than final data. Well, if you look and compare this first column here with this column here, well, once you get to any kind of reasonable window, you actually end up announcing more recessions using the real-time data than the final data. So it kind of appears it goes the wrong way, if you like, that if they are manipulating, they're causing more recessions to be announced than what is the final thing. Think of like, this is like the Cameron double dip. So the Cameron double dip appears in the real-time data and then doesn't appear in the final data. So we're reasonably confident to go forward that this is a well-identified randomized control trial type of environment, that economies are being randomly assigned to the treatment of whether you are getting a recession announcement or not. Okay, after a long time, I finally get to Gulchin's question of, okay, fine, let's see what's happening to the media. So we're looking at media effects. So what we did is we took major newspapers from 17 of those countries, us and these 4 beautiful RAs that we got, and we had them read newspapers. And they, on the basis of reading the newspaper, they decided whether, if you were an informed reader reading the newspaper, would you think that this economy is in recession or not? Would you think definitely it's in recession or possibly taking a recession? We asked them to look at the front page, and we asked them to look at the main economy page and read the articles and whether you would conclude. Those examples that I showed you earlier from the newspaper are obviously ones that would get picked up as you're in a recession. So this is sort of quantifying the simple examples I showed you through the newspaper. So that gives us, for each country and each quarter, a view of whether you would think this economy is in recession or not. So to answer Gulchin's question, I now have to see how that maps in with what I know about the GDP growth and whether that identified that you're in a recession or not. Right, this is the big way of showing the pictures in all the way through. So I'm going to go through this diagram quite slowly because it's the same format that comes into each. So on the left, I'm plotting growth in the previous quarter for all quarters where growth 2 quarters ago was negative. So this is going to be determining whether you're in a recession or not. And I'm plotting the vertical line there, 0. And so to the right, those are situations where the data should be saying you're not in a recession. And to the left, it's where situations where the data is saying you are in a recession. And then the vertical axis is plotting the probability that a newspaper reader would conclude that you're definitely in recession. So let's have a look at the picture itself. You've got dots on it. They're actually bins rather than particular dots. But this bin here is the very bottom bin here is saying in the range when growth was between 0 and 0.2, there's only like a 5% probability that you would think that the economy was in a recession. Whereas if I jump up to the left of the discontinuity, that's between 0 and minus 0.2, there's a 60-some% probability that a newspaper reader would think that there is a recession. So that's what the dots are doing. The lines are just regression lines through those bin dots, just to give you a bit of a clue as to what's going on. Then the right-hand side is showing, depending on the bandwidth, so depending how wide I make my area that I'm looking at, what's the discontinuity between coming from the right-hand side in versus the left-hand side in. And that's what's plotted here. If you take a very, very narrow bandwidth, you've got a lot of problems with bias. And so you have to use these sharp RDD estimates, and that picks up this dot here as the optimal bandwidth that's trading off the bias and the efficiency.
Martin, I think David also has a question. Yeah. David, do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi, Martin. Just a quick clarification about, so this is the chart on the left that I had a question about. So I think the way you described it, you've asked these RAs, sounds like quite a job you've given them, to read through all these articles. And I guess, there's a daily newspaper they're looking at, and you're asking them to assign a probability to the event the economy is in recession based on the newspaper they just read. So are these kind of like average probabilities over the quarter in question? That's the first part of the question. And the part two is, is there not like a text analysis type of exercise you could have used instead of asking these poor RAs to go through?
Okay.
Why did you go down that route?
Yeah. So the first, to answer the first, we weren't teasing the RAs too much, in the sense that the first flash estimate of GDP tends to come out in the first month of the quarter. And so we asked the RAs to read the newspaper in the middle of the quarter. So they didn't have to read the whole newspaper for every day in the quarter. They picked kind of in the middle of the quarter. And we asked them, we just asked them to make a judgment of 1 or 0. We didn't ask the RAs to give a probability. So the probabilities here you're seeing are probabilities across multiple countries or multiple recession events within countries. So when you get 60% here, 6 times when you were supposed to be in recession, the RAs concluded you were in recession, and 4 times they didn't. So that's how the probabilities work. You can do a textual analysis. We give money to RAs and they love it, so that's kind of okay. I mean, this is really a validation exercise, I think, that of course crossing the 0 actually creates announcements of a recession. We knew that. And so in part this is testing all our apparatus to confirm that it's doing what we did. The more interesting now is going to be crossing that same boundary. What effect does it have on other variables? If it didn't have an effect on the media, well, then something's gone seriously wrong. So we were not that bothered about nailing this really carefully.
I also have a question on this, in the sense that, so from how I understand the exercise, these dots that are aligned around the 1 are places where, the newspaper probably used the word recession, and there it was kind of obvious that they were announcing a recession. But, maybe these dots, with lower probabilities, are those still newspaper articles that would say recession, or do they require that the concept that the recession means 2 quarters of negative growth, and therefore you as an informed reader understand it? I mean, these two are kind of different in terms of the effects of the media announcement.
Yeah, so we tried to train the analysis, the RAs, to say whether it's in a recession or not, without telling them about the quarters of growth. So, if they picked up the newspaper and it was full of stories about record jobless, or orders of collapse, the sort of thing that the FT has, we would ask them to classify this as in recession. So they were not insisting on the word recession appearing, but I think the ones that are -4, these are so bad that the front page of the newspaper is absolutely full, or the front page of the Economy says this is growth 2 quarters ago was negative, and now we're at -4%. It's going to be full of bad stories.
No, I see that.
Yeah. But really, to go back to my answer to David, that we're not interested in the media effect, we're interested in the economic effect. But we think it goes through the media effect. And we use this as saying the media is highly correlated with the effects we're going to identify. It seems the obvious channel, but we don't sort of pin down that that's the channel.
I was just kind of trying to understand if for the points that are closer to the zero line, which are less obvious, are these all cases in which there is a more kind of obvious statement of whether these are announced as recessions, or what I'm trying to say is that, for these ones that have lower probability of being recognized as a recession, maybe having something that also helps you, I don't know, with textual analysis or something, or just a one-off or a 0-1 indicator of whether the newspaper has called it a recession could be interesting. That's what my...
Yeah, so I completely agree. I suspect what's happening is those, the stories are just nothing to do with the economy and GDP growth in those world. When growth is 1% or something, they're talking about the Enron scandal or whatever. That it's not salient at all. But I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm speculating at this point.
No, I understand it for these kind of extreme points where you're either in the positive or in the negative, kind of far off negative, but right along the line. But let me continue. Let me let you continue, and then if
I mean, you're right, because right along the line, that's where it really matters. Exactly. That's the key point. Yeah. Exactly. So as I say, over here we've got the optimal bandwidth, and if you present that in a table, it just tells you that the probability of a newspaper reader thinking we're in recession goes up by 50 basis points, or 50 percentage points, sorry, when you cross the boundary. Okay, so I'm going to show you a few more tables of that, but this time for effects on other stuff. So here's exactly the same type of exercise looking at consumer confidence. So what happens to consumer confidence as you cross the boundary? And you can see as you drop from the blue line to the red line, consumer confidence falls as you have this random event of announcing a recession. So it's significant at the optimal bandwidth, suggests that calling a recession actually does cause a drop in consumer confidence. Here's business confidence. That drops too, not quite as strong as what's happening to business confidence, and not quite attached to significance, but you do get a fall in consumer and business confidence when you announce a recession. In table form, these are quite large. I mean, that's a 1% drop in consumer confidence. But remember, consumer confidence, it bubbles between like 95 and 105. It's not something that goes from 1 to 100. So this is within the context of the fluctuations we see in consumer confidence. These are rather large. Similarly for business confidence, especially if you control for country fixed effects. This seems to be a story about depressed Japanese and Koreans. And my co-author is Korean, so I'm allowed to say this. But but business confidence in Japan and Korea are just way lower than everybody else's. They go up and down with the state of the economy, but they're just way lower. So even when a Japanese gets optimistic, they're still not as optimistic as the most pessimistic in other countries. So when you control for that, you start to see the significance coming through. But that's still confidence. That's response of survey evidence to announcement of a recession. I'm going to get more now at the economic response.
Sorry, let me just give you a reminder that let's say you have another 5 minutes.
Yeah, that's good.
A few 5 minutes for questions towards the end. Thanks.
Yeah. So here is final GDP growth, and these are actually our most robust estimates. You can't quite see very well on the dot picture, but you do get a significant effect on final GDP growth. So within the quarter that the recession is announced, remember the recession is announced on the basis of preliminary data. So this is looking at what happens to the final data, that's the final revised, and you get about 60 basis points loss of GDP growth because of the announcement in recession, which is, I think, large, quite a significant effect of that. Doing the tables, yeah, it just shows you that, about 60, so 0.6 of the growth rate just by announcing the recession. Here I've done a slightly more sophisticated, so it's local quadratic, and again, it all survives. This is a pretty robust result that's coming out. Here I'm splitting it up into the components of GDP, so consumption, investment, government spending, and imports. We don't really think of exports because presumably that's unaffected by what's going on domestically. And we get some evidence of a shift down in consumption, a little tiny bit in investment and government spending. So it looks like the drop in GDP is driven by consumption and then the variance, covariance of all these different components. So actually when consumption falls, investment tends to fall as well, and those all accumulate up to give you that significant GDP fall. Here's the estimates for the components. I've just got consumption coming out as significant. In a local quadratic estimator, I get them a bit more significant. But let me use the last couple of minutes to do one more exercise. And it's a falsification test. We've been looking at what happens if growth crosses zero. We looked at consumer confidence, consumption, and final growth. Let's look at whether anything happens when you cross other thresholds. What about if it's like -1 or +1 or -0.5, +0.5? Is there something special about zero that's moving, that crossing zero changes consumer confidence, consumption, and final GDP? So I'm going to do the whole exercise again, but with a different threshold. What I'm going to show you is its significant and correct sign only at zero. Summarize it all in one picture because we want to finish in finite time. Here is consumer confidence, and I'm looking at different thresholds here. So that zero is the one I've already shown you, that crossing the zero threshold hits consumer confidence by about 60 basis points. Here are all the other ones. Well, the zero is the most negative. It's the only one that's significant. So crossing any other boundary doesn't have any effect on consumer confidence, but crossing zero does, which suggests something of this announcement effect. Consumption growth, it's actually the only one that's significantly negative. I'm a little bit worried about this picture at the moment, but it should be the only one that's significantly negative. It's the fourth smallest, not quite the smallest, but it's coming up. And then when you look at final GDP growth, it's the most negative, it's the only significant one. Sorry, so there seems to be something special about zero.
Can I ask you something very quickly?
Yeah.
I mean, I totally buy the idea that there is something special about zero, but here on the consumer confidence, I see a positive significant effect for minus 0.4. Is that, or actually even for minus 0.3? What is this about? Do you have a?
So we should dig into it. I suspect what's happening is those are quite special. So there's probably not many data points in there.
Okay.
And they might be like recovery from very big recessions or something. So, this is all relative to what you expected in a way. So if you thought it was going to be -1 and it was -4, but I would have to dig into what the precise things there are.
Yeah. Thanks.
So conclusions and a joke to finish. Conclusions: newspapers report a recession after 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. That seems pretty clear. Recession announcement reduce these final estimates of GDP growth discontinuously. You get this downward jump in consumer confidence and consumption growth. If that's true, suggests all the stuff that Francesca and various other people have done about information imperfections probably matter. There seems to be something going on that consumers don't see through these recession announcements in a way that you might hope. And that's perhaps creating volatility at this around 0 point. Okay, joke to finish. Here is Alfred Khan. So Alfred Khan is part of Jimmy Carter's administration. Jimmy Carter getting pretty fed up with Alfred Khan for talking about recession, because he keeps talking about recession in his speeches. And so Khan says, okay, I'm going to change that. Every time I should say recession, I'm going to say banana instead. And that will solve the problem. Reading my paper, that's kind of right. But actually talking about a recession does impact negatively on the economy. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. This is really interesting. I welcome more questions. I have one, which I might ask, take my, privilege as a chair here to ask a question while other people start raising their hands in the last minute or two that we have left. Mainly what I wanted to ask you is a question that relates to what I was asking before, which is, so from my understanding of what your RAs have identified, the newspaper articles are about the economy not going okay, but it's not necessarily the announcement of a recession. It's, or have you also, do you also have an an indicator that kind of tells you if the word recession has appeared or not, in the sense that if this is about consumer confidence, it's probably people that maybe are less able to read through the newspaper on average than your RAs. And so maybe would not be able to, understand in detail if there is a recession based just on reading certain articles. So I just wanted to understand if, are these really recession announcements, or are these kind of sentiment kind of indicators that you have picked out in some sense?
Well, let me answer it in 2 ways. The first up, I think something happens in the newspaper when you cross 0, that the RAs have spotted something different from what was before. And that comes very clearly through. I'm quite confident that that's talking about that it's the recession that's actually triggered that. Now I can see we could do better on that. But at some level, I'm not that bothered that, okay, it seems that is happening. And then second, I think we're kind of picking up an instrument, which is the general sentiment that's being reported in the newspaper. And I don't see how else we could get at that other than that type of thing, because we can't look at consumer spending, because otherwise then, we've got a circularity going there. So I see it as we're picking up the mood of the country or something, and thinking that somewhat permeates down.
Yeah, no, I see it. I mean, it's a wider kind of a media sentiment thing. Yeah. Sorry, I see that also David has a question, so I'll allow him to unmute yourself, David, please, and Gulshin also, and then we'll have to close. So David,
super
please.
Super quick one from me. Martin, great talk, really good fun. Your findings. I was kind of wondering whether there's any way to look at like I was thinking about asset prices in particular, and whether looking at the response of asset prices to these types of discontinuities would be interesting. I say that because I think of asset market participants as being more sophisticated, who wouldn't be subject to these biases or narrative effects that you're describing, although maybe that's wrong, but it might be like an interesting control in some way. So I guess the announcement of the second quarter's negative growth, do share prices react to a greater degree?
So thank you, David. I agree that's interesting. I sort of see that as different, because that's more like the literature, that looks at, say, central bank announcements, and you put a tight window around the exact time of the announcement, and you look at what happened to exchange rates or stock markets or the long end of the yield curve. And I really like that stuff. But it seems that would be the way to sort of analyze that way, that whether, so I suppose you could complement it and say that you could do that sort of announcements effect and see whether the fact that the announcement also triggered a recession announcement had a bigger than expected effect. Maybe that would work.
That's kind of what I have in mind. So
as I was answering, I thought, that does actually make some sense. That would be interesting, because it's hard in our context because we've got lots of different countries, and so tracking down even when the announcement was made and finding what's the relevant stock market variable is a little bit different.
Of course, yeah. Great.
Thank you. Then I'll unmute Gulshin. Gulshin, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yes. Thank you, Francesca. Very quickly, Martin, I was just wondering whether there's any value in distinguishing between periods where the real-time data were confirmed to periods where they are overturned subsequently. Maybe enough data points.
That would be nice. I mean, so it goes back to what I said at the beginning of these like statistical errors and so on, whether we haven't looked at that, but you're right, that could be really interesting. Can I use the answer to give one more point? Because I didn't actually make it. So we've said that this GDP stuff is coming down within the quarter. It actually recovers in subsequent quarters. Right. So I think what's actually happening is people are reading the newspaper or taking part in the conversation and going, the economy is in a recession. I'll hold on from buying my new car or my new washing machine or some big purchase, and it gets pushed one quarter down the line and is just delayed a bit. So I don't think this has a permanent scarring effect on the economy, but it holds off on some consumption for the following quarter.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to need to close the seminar now because we're already 5 minutes over. But let me thank you again, Martin, for the really interesting talk. And thank you to all of you who participated and listened in and asked questions. Before we go, let me remind you that our next talk will be on the 26th of April. And it will be Samuel Hansen from Harvard Business School presenting his work on predictable financial crises. And with this, let me, say goodbye to everybody. Bye, Martin. Thanks again. And bye, everybody.